A man makes a promise to his dying wife. A simple promise. Don't let our boys become wolves. But promises, especially the ones made at a deathbed, have a funny way of breaking. And 3 years later, Thomas Sullivan wasn't just living with 5 boys. He was living in a den of wolves. The promise was made in the dead of a Colorado winter, a freak storm howling outside their tiny cabin like a beast trying to get in. Eleanor's hand was cold in his, a strange, chilling cold that defied the fever raging through her. Her breath was a fragile wisp of air. "Promise me, Thomas," she'd whispered, her blue eyes, once so full of life, now milky with pain. He'd leaned in, his rough forehead against hers, the smell of sickness and fear thick in the air. "I promise, Ellie. I won't let our family fall apart." She'd managed a faint smile. "You'll need help. Don't be too proud." "I'll manage," he'd choked out, a lie catching in his throat like a fishbone. They both knew it was over. The mountain fever had its claws in her deep, and the snow had buried the path to town. No doctor was coming, not in time. Her eyes flickered toward the other room, where their 5 sons slept, completely unaware that their world was about to be torn apart at the seams. "They'll need you," she'd rasped, "especially Daniel. He tries so hard to be a man already." "The medicine chest," she whispered, her voice fading to almost nothing. "Willow bark. Blue tin." "I'll get it," he'd said, squeezing her hand one last time. "I'll be right back." He wasn't. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her. And the promise he made? It shattered into a million pieces. 3 years later, Thomas stood in the middle of the same cabin, but it wasn't a home anymore. It was a wreck. Dirty dishes were stacked so high in the sink they looked like a leaning tower of filth. Muddy boots were everywhere. The curtains Eleanor had so carefully stitched were hanging by a thread, crooked and stained. Wood shavings, half-eaten food, and discarded animal pelts were scattered across the floor in a chaotic mess. This was the evidence of his failure. This was the monument to his broken promise. At 42, Thomas was still a bear of a man, strong from a life of wrestling with the mountains. But his hair was now shot with silver, his beard a wild, untamed thing, and his eyes had gone hard, wary, distant. In the corner, 14-year-old Daniel, the oldest, scraped a hunting knife against a whetstone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Each stroke was filled with a quiet, simmering rage that never seemed to leave him. He had his father's build and his mother's golden hair, but he was brittle like a dead branch ready to snap. "Pa," he said, not even bothering to look up. Logan tracked mud all over the floor again. Thomas let out a long, tired sigh. "Did you tell him to clean it up?" "I did." Daniel tested the blade with his thumb. He didn't listen. None of them ever listen. And he was right. Across the room, 12-year-old Matthew, the quiet one, was lost in one of his mother's books. He lived in those pages, escaping the noise and the mess. He'd traced the notes Eleanor had written in the margins of her Bible, trying to find her in the ink. The cabin door suddenly burst open, letting in a blast of frigid mountain air. 10-year-old Benjamin, a tornado of red hair and freckles, charged in. Right behind him was 8-year-old Joseph, his face a mess of dirt and tears. "Give it back!" Joseph wailed. "It's mine!" Benjamin held a small wooden wolf high above his head, dancing away from his brother. "I just want to look at it! Stop being such a baby!" "I'm not a baby!" Behind them stood 6-year-old Samuel, thumb in his mouth, his blue eyes wide and solemn. He had his mother's eyes. Sometimes looking at him felt like a punch to the gut. "Enough!" Thomas's voice was a low growl that cut through the chaos. "Benjamin, give it back. Joseph, stop that crying. And shut that door!" The noise stopped. The toy was returned. The door was shut. Then Samuel padded over, his small hand tugging on Thomas's pants. "Pa?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "When's Mama coming home?" The question landed like a stone, sending ripples of silence through the room. After 3 years, it still came out sometimes, usually when things were at their worst. The other boys froze. Before Thomas could find his voice, Matthew spoke gently. "Samuel, remember? Mama isn't coming back. She's with the angels now. Samuel's little lip trembled. But why can't she visit? Angels can fly. Thomas knelt, his big, rough hand on his son's shoulder. Some journeys are one way, son. She can't come back. Not even for Christmas? The hope in his son's eyes was a knife twisting in Thomas's chest. Not even then, but she's watching over us. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Empty. Useless. From the corner, Daniel scoffed. Fat lot of good that does us. And Thomas couldn't even find the strength to argue, because deep down, in the darkest corners of his heart, he agreed. They had tried to find help. Lord, they had tried. Every woman who had dared to step foot in this cabin had been run off by the pack of wolves his sons had become. First was Mrs. Grayson, a stern schoolteacher sent by the minister. She lasted 4 hours. Benjamin put a snake in her knitting. Daniel deliberately stomped mud across her clean floor. She packed her bags, her hands shaking. "They're not children," she'd declared. "They're savages." Next came Widow Jenkins, a kind, motherly woman who'd raised 6 of her own. She arrived with pies and a bright smile. She was gone by morning, the smile wiped clean off her face. That youngest one screamed for his mother all night, she'd told Thomas, dark circles under her eyes. And the oldest one? He told me I was trying to replace her. I can't help where I'm not wanted. The final, most humiliating attempt was the mail-order bride, Martha Henley. Her letters sounded practical, hard-working. Thomas had been brutally honest about his situation. 5 boys, a remote cabin, a hard life. Martha stepped off the stagecoach, took one long look at the 5 wild-eyed boys staring back at her, and turned right back around. "They're wolves, not boys," she'd said, loud enough for half the town to hear. "And I won't be the next thing they tear apart." After that, Thomas gave up. He had broken his promise. His boys were becoming exactly what Eleanor had feared, and he had no idea how to stop it. That night, after the chaotic energy of the cabin had finally settled into the restless sleep of 5 lonely boys, Thomas slipped out into the biting November air. He could smell it on the wind. A storm was coming, a big one. He went to his workshop, a place that used to be his sanctuary. It was where he'd turn raw wood into beautiful things, his big hands surprisingly gentle and precise. Eleanor used to sit with him, watching in quiet admiration. Now it was just a place where things went to gather dust. He walked past the workbench to a shelf in the corner. There, in a neat row that stood in stark contrast to the rest of his life, sat 5 small wooden horses. He had carved one for each of his sons on the day they were born. A proud stallion for Daniel, a steady mare for Matthew, a wild colt for Benjamin, a gentle foal for Joseph, and a tiny, perfect pony for Samuel. Eleanor had kept them on the mantel, dusting them, giving them names, weaving stories about them. After she was gone, he couldn't stand to look at them, so he'd moved them out here to be forgotten. He picked up Samuel's pony, the wood smooth and warm in his hand. He grabbed a fresh block of pine, his whittling knife feeling foreign in his grip. He tried to see the shape inside the wood, the way he used to, but when he made the first cut, his hand trembled and the knife slipped, gouging a deep, ugly scar in the wood. Damn it. Pa? Are you crying? Thomas spun around. Samuel was standing in the doorway, barefoot on the freezing ground, his small frame swallowed by his nightshirt. "No, son," Thomas said quickly, wiping his face on his sleeve. "Just dust in my eye. What are you doing out of bed?" "I heard you leave," Samuel said, patting over to his side. "I thought maybe you were going to find Mama." The words were a punch to the throat. "No, Samuel. I just needed a moment." Samuel's eyes fell on the horses, then to the scarred block of wood in his father's hand. "Were you making another horse?" "I was trying," Thomas admitted. "Who's it for?" Samuel asked. "You already made horses for all of us." Thomas looked at the mangled piece of wood. "I don't know," he said, the honesty of it surprising him. "I just felt like I should be making something." Samuel leaned against him, a small, warm weight that felt like both a comfort and an accusation. I miss when you used to make things, Pa. Mama said you could make anything. Your mama thought too highly of me. She said you made her happy, Samuel said, his voice small with sleepiness. He let out a big yawn. Can you make us happy again, Pa? Thomas had no answer. He just scooped his youngest son into his arms, feeling how impossibly light he was. As he carried Samuel back to the cabin, he looked up at the sky. The stars were gone, swallowed by a thick blanket of angry clouds rolling in from the west. The wind was picking up, and with it came the distant, mournful howl of wolves. A storm was coming, just like the one that had taken Eleanor, and he had a terrible feeling that they weren't ready for it. By morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray. The world had gone quiet, a dead, oppressive silence that meant big snow was on its way. "Daniel!" Thomas called as his oldest came in from the chicken coop. "More firewood! Now! Big storm's coming!" Daniel didn't argue. He just grabbed his coat. "How long you think?" Thomas scanned the horizon. 3 days, maybe 4. It's early this year. Just like the last one, the unspoken words hung between them. The boys worked with a grim efficiency born from a life spent at the mercy of the mountains. They knew a blizzard wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a killer. Firewood was stacked high. Food supplies were checked and double-checked. Livestock was secured. By midday, the first flakes began to fall, big and wet. The vanguard, the real army, was still on its way. As they ate a hurried lunch of dried venison and stale bread, Samuel piped up, his small face serious. "Will the angels be cold in the snow? Will Mama be cold?" A tense silence fell over the table. It was Matthew who answered, his voice soft. "Angels don't get cold, Samuel. They're beyond things like that." Daniel snorted. "Fat lot of good her prayers did us." "Daniel," Thomas warned, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "It's true," Daniel shot back, his eyes flashing. "All those women who came here, with their praying and their rules, none of them stayed. None of them cared enough when it got hard." The bitterness in his voice was a poison that had been brewing for 3 long years. "Your mother would have stayed," Thomas said quietly. Daniel's chair scraped violently against the floor as he shot to his feet. "But she didn't, did she? She left us here. Alone." Before Thomas could say another word, Daniel had grabbed his coat and stormed out into the swirling snow, slamming the door behind him. "He shouldn't go out," Joseph whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "He won't go far. He just needs to cool off." But as the afternoon wore on, and the snow began to fall in a thick, blinding curtain, a knot of worry tightened in Thomas's stomach. Daniel was smart. He knew better than to be caught outside in a blizzard. He should have been back by now. Just as Thomas was pulling on his own coat to go search for him, the door flew open with a crash. Daniel stumbled inside, his face pale as a ghost, a swirl of snow and wind rushing in with him. It wasn't the cold that had him shaking. "Pa," he gasped, his voice thin and reedy. There's something out there. Down by the traps, I heard it." Thomas's hand went instantly to the rifle hanging above the door. "An animal? Wounded deer?" Daniel shook his head, his eyes wide with a terror Thomas hadn't seen in him since he was a small boy. "No, it was human, I swear it. It sounded like someone crying." And just like that, the world shifted. "Matthew, you're in charge," Thomas commanded, his voice sharp. "Keep the fire going. Nobody leaves this cabin. Daniel, with me." They pulled on their heaviest gear, the wind already a physical force pushing against the cabin walls. Outside, the world had vanished. It was a swirling vortex of white, the snow already past their ankles and getting deeper by the second. "Where?" Thomas yelled over the roar of the wind. Daniel pointed toward a stand of pines, just a vague, dark shape in the blizzard. "Over there!" Thomas squinted, his eyes stinging from the ice crystals in the air. He saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement, a dark smudge against the endless white. It wasn't one shape, it was 3. One tall figure, staggering, supporting 2 smaller ones. They were moving toward the cabin, a slow, agonizing crawl through the storm. "Hello!" Thomas bellowed, his voice snatched away by the wind. "Who's there?" A voice came back, faint and desperate. "Help us! Please!" Thomas and Daniel plunged forward, the deep snow sucking at their boots. As they got closer, the shapes became clearer. It was a man, his head wrapped in a bloody makeshift bandage. Leaning on him was an elderly woman, barely conscious. And holding them both up, a tiny figure straining with all her might, was a little girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old. They were all dressed in city clothes, thin and useless against the fury of a mountain blizzard. But it was the girl who held Thomas's gaze. Her dark hair was tangled with ice, her lips were blue with cold, but her brown eyes were clear, steady, and filled with a fierce determination that defied the storm raging around her. She was the anchor. She was the one holding them all together. She looked up at Thomas, her voice raspy but surprisingly calm. "Denver stagecoach overturned," she said. "Please, help us." The journey back to the cabin was a brutal, slow-motion nightmare. Thomas took the weight of the old woman, her body limp and surprisingly heavy. Daniel struggled to support the injured man, who was groaning with every step. The little girl, relieved of her burden, swayed on her feet but refused to fall. She trudged beside them, the snow up to her knees, her small face set in a grim mask of determination. "Anyone else?" Thomas shouted over the wind. The girl's face tightened. "The driver. He didn't make it." "What's your name, child?" "Grace," she replied, her voice steady. "Grace Miller. These are my guardians. We were going to California." By the time they staggered back to the cabin, Thomas's fingers were numb stumps and Daniel was on the verge of collapse. Matthew threw the door open, his eyes widening at the sight. "Boys, clear a space by the fire!" The cabin exploded into a frenzy of controlled chaos. Furniture was shoved aside, blankets were pulled from chests, even little Samuel ran to get his own small quilt. They laid the injured man, Holloway, near the hearth. He was mumbling, disoriented. "Abigail, where's Abigail?" "She's right here," Thomas assured him, gently lowering the old woman onto a pallet of blankets. Her skin was burning hot, a dangerous fever raging despite the freezing cold she'd endured. Through it all, the little girl, Grace, moved with a strange, unnerving purpose. She knelt by the old woman, Mrs. Wilson, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. Then she moved to the man, her eyes critically examining the bloody bandage on his head. She looked up at Thomas, her gaze direct. "Do you have clean bandages? Mr. Holloway's cut needs cleaning, and Mrs. Wilson has a fever. Do you have any willow bark tea?" Thomas just stared at her. "How do you know about willow bark?" "My father taught me," she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Before he died. It helps with pain and fever." He exchanged a stunned look with Daniel. The other boys had fallen silent, just watching this tiny, bossy stranger who had literally walked out of a blizzard and started giving orders. "Matthew," Thomas finally managed to say, "show her the medicine chest." As his sons scrambled to help, Thomas knelt by Holloway. The man's eyes were glassy, but he was trying to focus. "Stage went over on the bend," he rasped. "Rolled twice. The child, Grace. She pulled us out. Bound my head. Tried to help the driver. But he was gone." Thomas glanced over at Grace. She was now at the fireplace, expertly measuring herbs into a pot of boiling water, giving quiet instructions to Matthew. A 9-year-old girl pulled 2 grown adults from a wrecked stagecoach in a blizzard. It didn't seem possible. "You're lucky to have found us," Thomas said. Holloway gave a weak, rattling cough that might have been a laugh. "Luck had nothing to do with it. The child. She saw the smoke from your chimney. Said we should head for it. I thought we were done for. But she wouldn't give up." Just then, Mrs. Wilson began to moan. Grace was at her side in an instant, pressing a cool cloth to the woman's forehead, her voice a low, soothing murmur. The old woman seemed to quiet under her touch, turning toward the sound of the child's voice. Little Samuel had crept closer, his eyes wide with awe, watching her work. "Are you an angel?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the quiet hum of activity. Grace looked up, and for the first time, a real smile touched her lips, transforming her serious face. "No," she said gently. I'm just a girl. But you came in the storm, Samuel insisted. And you're helping. That's what angels do. Grace's smile faded slightly, a shadow passing over her eyes. A darkness that shouldn't be in the eyes of a child. I try to make things better, she said softly. Sometimes that's all anyone can do. The wind howled outside, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. They were trapped. All of them. Together. You're all welcome here until the storm passes, Thomas told her. She nodded. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I'll try not to be a burden. Thomas looked at this small, composed child who had more strength and sense than most adults he knew. He looked at his 5 sons, watching her with a mixture of suspicion and wonder. He looked at the 2 injured strangers whose lives now rested in their hands. This storm hadn't just brought snow, it had brought something else entirely. Pa? Samuel whispered, tugging on his sleeve. I think God sent us an angel after all. Thomas didn't have the heart to tell him that, in his experience, angels never stayed long in the Sullivan cabin. And he couldn't bear to watch the hope die in his son's eyes when this one left too, because they always left. As night fell, the storm outside became a screaming monster. The wind shrieked and clawed at the cabin, and snow piled up against the windows, blotting out the world. Inside, a strange new order had taken hold, and at the center of it all was Grace. She had found Eleanor's old apron and tied it around her tiny frame, the fabric wrapping around her twice. The sight of it, filled again after 3 empty years, made Thomas's throat ache. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was nothing short of miraculous. She tended to Mrs. Wilson, who was delirious with fever. She checked on Mr. Holloway, and then she started to cook. Not just warming beans from a can, but real cooking. The smell that filled the cabin was something they hadn't experienced in years. It was the smell of home. She'd found a forgotten jar of Eleanor's dried herbs in the back of a cupboard and used them to make a simple but incredible stew. As the boys gathered around the table, their usual rowdiness replaced by a stunned silence, Daniel stared at his bowl, his eyes narrowed. You're using Ma's things, he said, his voice laced with accusation. Her apron, her herbs. The air in the cabin crackled with tension. Grace froze, her ladle hovering over the pot. I'm sorry, she said, her voice soft. I should have asked. I just thought, with everyone being sick, a proper meal would help. Thomas opened his mouth to intervene, to tell Daniel to stand down. But before he could, Daniel gave a stiff, jerky nod. It's fine, he grunted, though his face said otherwise. Ma would have wanted her things used. Grace seemed to understand the complex mix of permission and warning in his words. She quietly served Daniel the largest portion. The oldest brother needs the most strength, she said. He carries the heaviest burden. Something in Daniel's rigid posture seemed to soften. Just a little. As they ate, a profound silence fell over the table. It was the best meal they'd had in 3 years. This is good, Thomas said, his voice thick. Thank you, Grace. She ducked her head. My pa taught me. He said food tastes better when it's made with attention. Your pa taught you to cook? Benjamin asked, his mouth full. Grace nodded. After my mama died, it was just me and him. Had to learn fast. The simple, matter-of-fact statement hung in the air. Thomas watched his sons exchange a look. In that moment, they understood. This strange girl from the storm. She was one of them. She knew what it was to lose everything. What happened to your pa? Joseph asked quietly. Pneumonia, Grace said, her voice steady. Last winter. After he died, I went to stay with relatives in Denver. But then, there was a fire. She stopped, a flicker of something terrible passing behind her eyes. Mr. Holloway and Mrs. Wilson were taking me to my great-aunt in California. Are you sad? Samuel asked, with the brutal honesty of a child. Grace looked at him, and her expression was ancient. Yes, but being sad doesn't help anyone. My pa said when life gives you grief, You can either let it break you, or you can use it to understand other people's pain. She looked around the table, her gaze landing on each of the boys. I think all of you understand about grief. And with those words, a crack appeared in the wall of ice that had surrounded the Sullivan family for 3 years. They weren't alone in their pain. This child, this stranger, she understood. Later, after the dishes were washed, properly washed for the first time in ages, Thomas found Grace by Mrs. Wilson's bedside. The old woman was worse. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged sound. Her skin was dry and hot as a furnace. "The fever's getting stronger," Grace said, her voice heavy with a gravity no child should possess. "You've done everything you can," Thomas told her, her small chin lifted. "Not everything. Not yet." She sat beside the dying woman, taking one of her frail, restless hands, and she began to talk, softly, gently, a constant, soothing murmur, a lifeline of words in the dark, feverish night. It was a painful echo of Eleanor's last hours. But this time, someone was there. Someone was holding her hand. As the boys climbed the ladder to the loft, Thomas stopped them. "Boys," he said quietly, "be on your best behavior. That little girl has been through more than any of us." From the shadows of the loft, Daniel's voice cut through the darkness, cold and sharp. "She won't stay, Pa. None of them ever do." Thomas had no reply, because he was afraid his son was right. He kept vigil that night, moving between the fitfully sleeping Mr. Holloway and the rapidly fading Mrs. Wilson. He watched Grace, who had curled up on the floor by the old woman's bed, never letting go of her hand. She was a tiny, fierce guardian, refusing to let the woman die alone. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt a flicker of purpose. Outside, the blizzard raged, erasing the world. But inside, under the care of a 9-year-old orphan, something that had been frozen solid for 3 long years was finally, painfully, beginning to thaw. The next morning, the storm took a breath. The wind died down, and a strange, muffled silence fell over the snow-choked world. But it was a trick. Thomas knew it. This was just the eye of the storm. The second, more vicious wave was still to come. Inside the cabin, another storm was breaking. Mrs. Wilson was dying. Her breathing was a faint whisper, the spaces between each breath growing longer and longer. The fever had won. Grace was at her side, her small face pale but composed. She had been up all night, tending to the old woman. When Thomas found her, she was already awake, having rekindled the fire and set water to boil. But what stopped him dead in his tracks was the smell. The rich, tangy, unforgettable smell of baking sourdough bread. He stared at the Dutch oven nestled in the coals. "You made bread?" Grace nodded, a flicker of pride in her tired eyes. "I found some starter in the pantry. It was almost gone, but there was just enough to revive. Eleanor's starter, the one she had fed and nurtured for over a decade. He'd forgotten all about it. He'd let it die, just like he'd let everything else die. But Grace had found it. She had brought it back to life. "Sourdough can last a very long time," she said softly, "if you're careful with it. Just like memory. Just like love." As Grace tended to Mrs. Wilson, preparing her for the final journey with a quiet dignity that was heartbreaking to watch, Mr. Holloway sat beside his old friend, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The boys watched, their faces solemn. They knew what death looked like. "Is she going to be with the angels? Like Mama?" Samuel whispered. "Yes," Grace answered, her voice clear and steady. "She's very tired. The angels will take her where she can rest. Does it hurt? Dying?" Grace looked at the small boy, her expression serious. "I don't think so. My pa said it was like falling asleep after a long, hard day. The body fights, but the soul knows it's time to rest." The end came peacefully, a final, shallow breath, and then stillness. Grace gently closed the old woman's eyes. "Go in peace," she whispered. Later, as the wind began to howl again, signaling the storm's return, Grace found Thomas staring out the window. "You're very strong for someone so young," he said. A shadow crossed her face. "I've had practice," she replied. "When you lose everyone, you either learn to be strong or you break. I promised my pa I wouldn't break." Her words were a gut punch. Before he could respond, she discovered Eleanor's old recipe book, tucked away and forgotten. Thomas felt a jolt seeing it in her hands. It was filled with Eleanor's handwriting, her notes, her love, scribbled in the margins. "She loved you all so much," Grace said softly, tracing the faded ink. "You can feel it." Thomas had to turn away, his eyes burning. That afternoon, Grace baked bread from Eleanor's recipe. The smell, so familiar it was a physical ache, filled the cabin. When she sliced it, still warm, and spread it with the last of Eleanor's blackberry jam, the taste was a ghost on his tongue. It was a memory of a happier life. "It's like Mama's," Joseph said, his eyes wide with wonder. And it was. It was exactly like hers. That night Grace found Eleanor's Bible. As she read from it, her clear voice filling the quiet cabin, pressed flowers, tiny, forgotten mountain blooms, fell from between the pages. "She pressed flowers," Grace said, a note of delight in her voice. "My mother did the same thing." It was another strange, impossible connection. Another thread tying this little girl to the woman she'd never known. The boys discovered their mother's notes in the margins, messages of love written just for them. And for a few hours, Eleanor was alive in that room again, brought back by a 9-year-old stranger. After the boys were in bed, Grace sat by the fire, her face old and weary in the flickering light. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I need to tell you something." He sat down beside her. "Mr. Holloway and Mrs. Wilson, they weren't really my guardians. We'd only just met. My real guardians, the ones who took me in after my father died. They died in that house fire. All my relatives. They're gone too." She looked up at him, her eyes dark and bottomless. "I don't have anywhere to go when this storm ends," she said with a calm, terrifying honesty. "I wanted you to know, so you could decide what to do with me." The storm raged on for 3 more days, trapping them in a world of white. And in that time, Grace became the quiet, steady heart of the Sullivan family. She cooked and cleaned. She taught Samuel to make bread. She helped Benjamin with his drawing. She drew Joseph out of his shell. She even managed to chip away at the wall of ice around Daniel. She was healing them, one meal, one story, one act of kindness at a time. On the 4th day, the sun finally broke through. The world outside was a pristine, glittering landscape of white. And with the sun came a visitor, a lone rider, picking his way through the deep drifts. It was Sheriff Clayton Montgomery. "Sullivan!" he called out. "Saw your smoke! Everyone all right up here?" Thomas went out to meet him, a sense of dread coiling in his gut. Grace watched from the doorway, her face pale. "We're fine, Sheriff. Had some unexpected company, though. The Denver stagecoach overturned down at the bend." The sheriff's face grew grim. "We heard it was missing. Any survivors?" "3, Thomas said. A man, a child, and an elderly woman who didn't make it through the fever." The sheriff came inside, his eyes landing immediately on Grace. He took statements from Mr. Holloway, his pencil scratching in a small notebook. Then he turned to Grace. "So, Miss Miller, Mr. Holloway tells me you were on your way to relatives in California?" Grace nodded. "My great-aunt, sir." "And your guardians in Denver? A Mr. and Mrs. Porter?" "Yes, sir." The sheriff stopped writing. He looked at Thomas, and his eyes were full of a terrible pity. "Grace," he said gently, "I received a telegraph from Denver before the storm hit. The authorities there have been looking for a child matching your description." He took a deep breath. "According to them, there is no legal record of a Grace Miller. The Porters did die in a fire, but they had no child living with them. And your great-aunt in California, a Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, she also died in a fire in San Francisco 2 months ago." The silence in the cabin was absolute. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying," the sheriff said, his voice heavy, that legally speaking, this child doesn't exist. No guardians, no relatives, no one. According to the law, I have to take her to the St. Agnes Orphanage in Denver. No! Samuel screamed, launching himself at Grace and wrapping his small arms around her waist. She's our angel! You can't take her! The other boys moved in, forming a protective wall around the small girl. Even Daniel stood between her and the sheriff, his jaw set, his eyes blazing. She belongs here, Daniel said, his voice thick with an emotion Thomas hadn't heard in years. She's family. The sheriff looked pained but resolute. Boys, the law is the law. Please, Grace whispered, her composure finally cracking. Please don't send me to an orphanage. It was then that Mr. Holloway, the injured passenger, struggled to his feet. Sheriff, he said, his voice surprisingly strong, there's something else, something you need to see. He retrieved a water-damaged leather envelope from his bag. This arrived for me just before we left Denver. I'm a solicitor, you see. I was trying to locate this man when the accident happened. He handed the letter to Thomas. It was addressed to Mr. Thomas Sullivan, Sullivan Cabin, Western Range, Colorado. Who is it from? Thomas asked, his hands trembling. A colleague, Holloway said, regarding the last will and testament of a Mr. William Miller. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow, a ghost from another life, a quiet, steady man who had saved his life on the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg. William Miller, he breathed. Grace's father, Holloway confirmed, and your former brother-in-arms during the war. Grace stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You knew my father? You're the Thomas Sullivan he told me about? Thomas could only nod, his mind reeling. He tore open the letter. It was dense with legal jargon, but the meaning was brutally clear. William Miller, in the event of his death, had named Thomas Sullivan as the legal guardian for his daughter, Grace. The sheriff read it over his shoulder. Well, I'll be. This changes things. The courts would likely honor a will. He paused. But a single man, raising a young girl with 5 boys, it will still be a fight. Grace's eyes filled with tears, the first he'd seen her shed. He remembered, she whispered. He told me if anything ever happened, I should find you. He said you were the most honorable man he'd ever known. This child hadn't found them by accident. She'd been sent. There's more, Mr. Holloway said, his face falling. The original will, the trust documents, Grace's birth certificate, all her legal papers. They were in my satchel, the one I lost in the crash. The sheriff's face hardened. So without those papers, we're back where we started. A letter isn't enough. I need the actual documents. The hope that had flared so brightly was extinguished in an instant. She was going to the orphanage after all, until Daniel's voice cut through the despair. Then we'll find them, he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. The satchel has to be out there. We'll find it. One by one, the other boys stepped forward. We have to try, Matthew said. She's our family now, Benjamin shouted. She's our angel, Samuel insisted. Thomas looked at his sons, truly united for the first time in 3 years. He looked at Grace, the small, quiet girl who had somehow managed to piece their broken family back together. We'll search, Thomas said, his voice firm. All of us. The sheriff sighed. All right, Sullivan. We'll search. But if we don't find those papers by sundown, I have to take her. It's my duty. As they prepared to head out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of snow, Grace looked up at Thomas, her dark eyes searching his. You don't have to do this. He knelt down in front of her. Grace Miller, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You have done more for this family in a few days than anyone has in 3 years. Your father trusted me to care for you. I will not fail him. And I will not fail you. For the first time since she had stumbled out of that storm, the little girl threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. Thank you, she sobbed into his shoulder. Now, he said, holding her close, let's go find your future. The search was a desperate race against the sun. Thomas and his 5 boys, along with the sheriff, fanned out across the snow-covered landscape, using long poles to probe the deep drifts. The sun was a cold, bright disk in the sky, its light glinting off the endless white. They had 5 hours of daylight, maybe less. The satchel was brown leather, brass buckles. That's all they had to go on. It could be anywhere, buried under feet of snow. The task felt impossible, hopeless. Thomas worked alongside Daniel, a comfortable silence settling between them for the first time in years. "Pa," Daniel said finally, do you really want her to stay?" Thomas didn't have to think about it. "I do," he said. "She brought something back to this house I thought we'd lost forever." Daniel nodded, plunging his pole into a deep drift. "I was angry at first, when she used Ma's things. But I think Ma would have liked her. She just helps. She doesn't try to fix us." It was the most vulnerable Thomas had seen his son since Eleanor died. It was a crack in the armor, a beginning. Hours passed. The sun crept across the sky. The cold began to seep into their bones. Every time a pole hit something solid, hope would surge, only to be crushed when it turned out to be a rock or a frozen log. Then, a shout. "I found something!" It was Benjamin. He was digging frantically in the snow, and he pulled out a leather bag. But it was small, too small. It was Mrs. Wilson's handbag. Another dead end. The day was dying. The shadows grew long and skeletal across the snow. The temperature was dropping fast. "We need to head back," the sheriff said, his face grim. "It's not safe to be out here much longer." Thomas felt a cold dread wash over him. They had failed. He was going to have to watch the sheriff ride away with Grace, taking the last bit of light from their lives with her. It was over. "Pa, look!" It was Matthew. He was standing farther down the creek, pointing. "A trail!" It wasn't much. Just a line of disturbed snow and broken branches leading up a steep bank into a thicket of mountain laurel. But scattered along it were scraps of paper, half buried in the snow. "Something was dragged through here," Matthew said, his eyes bright with intelligence. "During the storm. It tore the papers out as it went." They followed the trail of scattered documents up the bank, into the dense, tangled thicket. And there, wedged deep beneath a tangle of branches, was a dark shape. It took them 20 minutes of frantic digging and cutting, their hands raw and bleeding from the cold and the sharp branches, but they pulled it free. A battered, water-stained brown leather satchel with brass buckles. Mr. Holloway let out a cry of triumph. "That's it! That's my satchel!" His hands shook as he fumbled with the buckles. He pulled out a thick sheaf of documents, miraculously protected by the heavy leather. "The will," he breathed, holding it up. "Grace's birth certificate. The trust documents. It's all here." The sheriff examined the papers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "They appear to be genuine," he said slowly. "This gives you the right to petition the court for guardianship, Sullivan." Relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over Thomas. He looked at Grace. Her perfect composure had finally shattered. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks as Samuel hugged her tightly. "You can stay!" the little boy yelled. "You can be our sister forever!" But the sheriff held up a hand. "Hold on. This isn't over. This just gets you in the door. A judge will still have to approve it. And a single man with 5 boys living way out here? It's a long shot, Sullivan. A real long shot." The battle was won. But the war for Grace's future had just begun. The trip to Denver was a journey into another world. The noise, the crowds, the endless churn of the city was a jarring contrast to the deep silence of the mountains. The boys stared out of the wagon, their eyes wide. They met with a lawyer, a stuffy old man named Hartwell, who confirmed their worst fears. "Judge Whitaker is a stickler for propriety," he'd said, peering at Thomas over his spectacles. "A single man raising a young girl, it's highly unconventional. He will want to know who will provide the necessary feminine guidance." He cleared his throat. "A wife, Mr. Sullivan, would substantially strengthen your petition." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marry a stranger? Betray Eleanor's memory? He couldn't. It was impossible. That night, in their stuffy hotel room, he told Grace what the lawyer had said. She looked up from the book she was reading to Samuel, her expression thoughtful. He's right. A girl needs a mother figure. Then her eyes lit up. What about Mrs. Henderson from the next valley? Or Mrs. Murphy from the general store? They could visit. They could teach me. It was Daniel who spoke up from the corner where he'd been brooding. She's right, Pa. We don't need you to marry some stranger. We just need to show the judge that Grace won't be alone. It was a brilliant, simple solution. A plan born from the mouths of children. They spent the next day sending telegrams. The responses that came back were a flood of support from the tight-knit mountain community. Yes, Mrs. Henderson would teach Grace to sew and cook. Yes, Mrs. Murphy would provide guidance and necessities. Yes, the traveling preacher would testify to their moral character. They were building an army of support, a network of care around one small girl. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was a cold, imposing chamber of judgment. Judge Whitaker was exactly as advertised, stern, sharp-eyed, and radiating an aura of absolute authority. He laid out the facts, his voice booming in the silent room. A widower, 5 sons, a remote mountain cabin. Mr. Sullivan, explain to me why this is a suitable environment for a young girl. Thomas stood, his heart pounding. He explained their plan, presenting the letters of support. The judge read them, his expression unreadable. Then he called on the boys. One by one, they stood and spoke. Matthew, the quiet scholar, talked about how he was teaching Grace, how she was already reading at a level far beyond her age. Daniel, the angry one, spoke of how their mother had been a teacher, and how they were just continuing her lessons. Benjamin, the wild child, talked about how Grace encouraged his art. Joseph, the sensitive soul, spoke of how she comforted his nightmares. And little Samuel just said, "She makes the best pancakes, and she makes me feel safe." Finally, the judge turned to Grace. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice softening slightly, "do you wish to remain with this family?" Grace stood, a tiny, solitary figure in that vast room. She clasped her hands in front of her, and her voice, when it came, was clear and strong, and filled with a truth that silenced the entire courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor. More than anything." She told him about being an orphan, an obligation. "But with the Sullivans," she said, her voice ringing with passion, "I'm not an obligation. I'm chosen. They want me, not because they have to, but because they love me, and I love them." She took a deep breath, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Your Honor, I know that love makes a family real, and choice makes it strong. The Sullivans chose me when they could have sent me away. They made space for me when their lives were already full of grief. They loved me when I was a stranger who brought them nothing but trouble. That's the family I want to belong to. Not because a court says I should, but because my heart says I already do." The silence that followed was profound. Judge Whitaker looked at the 7 people before him. A broken man, 5 wild boys, and the small girl who had saved them all. He took off his spectacles, polishing them slowly. "In all my years on this bench," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I have rarely seen such compelling evidence that a child has found where she truly belongs." He put his spectacles back on and picked up his pen. With a flourish, he signed the document on his desk. Petition for guardianship. Approved. The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. It was done. She was theirs. Outside, in the bright Denver sunshine, the Sullivan family, all 7 of them, came together in a circle of hugs and tears and laughter. "You're really our sister now," Samuel shouted. Thomas knelt down in front of Grace. He finally told her the secret he'd carried for 3 years, the guilt that had eaten him alive, that he wasn't there when Eleanor died, that he'd left to get medicine, trying to be a hero, and had come back to a cold, empty cabin. Grace took his big, calloused hand in her small one. "It doesn't change how much you loved her," she said, her wisdom once again reaching far beyond her years. "That's what matters. Not where we are when someone dies, but how we lived with them when they were here. 1 year later, the Sullivan cabin was no longer a den of wolves. It was a home. It was loud and chaotic, but it was filled with life and laughter. Grace, now 10, was the calm, steady center of their world. The boys, one by one, had healed under her quiet care. Daniel was no longer angry but protective. Matthew dreamed of being an engineer. Benjamin's art filled the walls. Joseph was the gentle peacemaker, and Samuel was a happy, secure little boy. That night, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Thomas led Grace out to his workshop. The 5 wooden horses he'd carved for his sons still stood on the shelf. But now there was a 6th. He uncovered it, revealing a beautifully carved mare, its head held high, a single perfect rose etched into its saddle. "It's for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You brought beauty back into our lives, Grace. You reminded us how to be a family." She threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered, "for choosing me." He held his daughter, his heart full for the first time in a very long time. Back inside, he gathered his family around the table. He pulled a small package from his pocket and gave it to Grace. It was a delicate gold locket, Eleanor's. Inside was a tiny picture of her, and on the other side, a new picture of the 7 of them, a strange, cobbled together, and fiercely loving family. The promise he'd made to his dying wife had been broken into 1,000,000 pieces. But this little girl, this angel from the storm, had painstakingly gathered up every last shard and glued them back together, creating something new, something stronger, something whole. If you were moved by this story of a family rebuilt from the ashes, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what incredible stories you might find in the most unexpected places.